Okay. I was going to say I got a huge feedback problem, but it's gone now. I'm going to talk a little bit about nutrition and a little bit about exercise today, and especially focusing on mental health. And I will leave some time at the end for questions, so just jot them down, and we'll find a time to discuss those at the end. I want to start with a very simple slide here showing what I refer to as the wellness continuum. And I think we're all familiar with the idea that on one end of this is disease that we want to stay away from, and the other end is wellness that we want to be attracted towards. But I think we need to understand too that most of us operate somewhere in the middle here. We think we're out here in the wellness part, but actually we're more somewhere in the middle. We're not sick, but we're not optimally well either. And so what I spend my time doing is trying to get people from the middle of this continuum out into this wellness area. And a lot of people end up telling me after they do certain things that they've never felt better in their life. So that's what we're going to talk about. How do we get out here? What do we need to do? And a couple of things I think that are the most important, or what I refer to as the big two, are nutrition and physical exercise. And not only do they have the biggest impact, but they're the ones that are under our control. And obviously, that's critical. Unfortunately, we don't always take advantage of these, though. For example, for about 50 years at least, we've known that regular physical activity is health promoting, and especially toward mental health. But surveys tell us that about 15% of Canadians exercise regularly to the point where it will benefit their health. So that means about 85% aren't doing it. And it's not because they don't know about it, because we've been promoting this for years. So we not only have to know it's beneficial, we have to figure out ways to get people to actually do it. And the traditional 30 to 45 minutes of moderate intensity exercise is health promoting, but it's very difficult to get people to do. So we need to focus on other types of exercise. And it's the same way with nutrition. Most people think it's fairly simple, but in fact, it's very complex. And if your micronutrient intake gets out of whack, it might take weeks or months before you encounter a problem, and you don't attribute it to your diet because nothing has changed in the last few weeks or months, and yet all of a sudden you're not well. So I want to hit upon some of the basic fundamentals that you can think about and incorporate into your daily life. So let's talk a little bit about nutrition first of all. One of the things that I really like to emphasize is whole foods are important. So we need to think in terms of avoiding packaged food. So if it comes in a package, it's been processed, and that means it's been altered from its normal state. And in many cases, that means it's much less nutritious. And unfortunately, we have marketers who make six-figure salaries figuring out ways to get us to buy these packaged foods that aren't really very nutritious. They make them very inexpensive, they make them very convenient. But when we eat them over time, we are not in that wellness end of the continuum. We move more in the middle somewhere. So we really want to think about emphasizing whole foods, and we want to think about a variety of foods. So we don't want to get into any sort of restrictive diets where we're focusing on just a few items. And we really want to specialize in a variety of colors. And so this would be largely vegetables and fruits, because a lot of the micronutrients and the nutraceuticals are in high concentration in the really vibrant color foods. So two basic rules is avoid packages and eat a lot of colorful food. With respect to physical activity, and I'll cover this toward the end, a good thing to remember is that any activity is better than nothing. So I think we made a mistake when I was a student where we were promoting 150 minutes of exercise a week or 30 minutes a session. We made it kind of overwhelming. And it turns out that you can benefit, receive the health benefits from physical activity with very, very small amounts of activity. We'll talk about that later. The other thing to keep in mind is that if you think in terms of how hard you exercise or the intensity versus the duration, there's no question that intensity is most important. So brief, intense exercise has health promoting effects much more so than more moderate, prolonged exercise. And it also has the advantage of it can be done very quickly. And since we're all busy, we have very little time. If brief exercise can be beneficial, then that's encouraging. And as you'll see, it definitely is. So for some reason, I'm a little bit delayed here. I want to talk a little bit about mental illness, because if we define that as I have here schizophrenia, depression, epilepsy, dementia, and alcohol dependence, it accounts for about 13% of diseases worldwide, which is kind of interesting because that exceeds cardiovascular disease and cancer, which probably surprises you, and mainly because we have this stigma about mental illness, and um, it's not as widely known. People tend to keep it secretive if they're experiencing some mental illnesses. But of course, it often has an underlying cause. And one of the interesting things I want to communicate today is that diet plays a huge role in mental illness, both directly and indirectly. And if we don't think it's an important problem, as I've indicated here, that depending on the source, there are estimates as high as 15 to 30 million people attempt suicide a year worldwide. So it's a huge public health problem. If we look at the Canadian diet, and I'm referring to it here as the highly processed Canadian diet, meaning that most foods that most Canadians eat are highly processed and therefore have lost a lot of their nutrients along the way. A highly processed Canadian diet leads to an increase in both depression and anxiety, and these are rampant today, as you know. If we compare that with the Mediterranean style diet, popular in the Mediterranean area, you've probably heard the term, you may be familiar with it. I'm going to describe it a little bit in a minute, but it's really not only a diet, but a way of life, which I think is what we need to think about when we think about nutrition. But it's very protective toward mental illness relative to the typical Canadian diet. And it's not only directly so, indirectly so, in that the Mediterranean diet decreases obesity risks significantly when we compare it with the Canadian diet. And obesity is closely associated with depression and dementia. For example, if you are obese in midlife, your risk of dementia as you get older is increased substantially. So if we can decrease obesity, we can reduce the onset of some types of mental illness. So both directly and indirectly, this type of diet is way better than the typical Canadian diet. Well, why is that? Well, let's look at what's involved in the Mediterranean diet. As I mentioned, it's more than just a diet, it's a way of life. Essentially what it does is, if you look over on the right side here, it divides some things into foods that you eat daily, some that you eat a few times a week, and some that you eat a few times a month. And it differs substantially from the typical Canadian diet. The size of the pyramid here, the base is meant to denote larger amounts of food. So if you compare whole grains down here in the bottom, they would provide a large percent of the calories relative to red meat, or to sweets, which are up here at the top of the pyramid. So this diet focuses a great deal on whole grains, focuses on vegetables and fruits, including red wine. Um, Large emphasis on beans and legumes, which tend to be very small in a Canadian diet. Healthy fats, including olive oil, which is very prominent in this part of the world. Much less so on dairy products. Um, Other types of fats and meats only a few times a week as opposed to daily, which we find in most Canadians, and red meat a few times a month as opposed to more regularly. In addition, as is indicated here, I mentioned red wine, physical activity. I'll talk about that in a minute. It's part of the lifestyle. So in summary, a Mediterranean diet really is focusing on primarily fruits and vegetables, whole grains, and healthy fats on a daily basis. On a weekly basis, a lot more fish than Canadians are consuming, but less poultry. Beans and eggs would be on a weekly basis as well. Um, Much less dairy and much less red meat. So it is substantially different, which means the nutrients in these foods are going to be in much different proportions with people who consume these diets. There's been a lot of study of this Mediterranean diet over the years because it does seem to be very health promoting and not just from a mental health perspective. I mentioned it's more of a way of life. As you can see in the picture on the left here, um, people in this part of the world really share meals together with friends and family, kind of like what Canadians used to do. I know growing up as a child, we would have meals as families all the time, but I don't see that very often anymore. I see a lot of people eating on the run, on the way to their practice or their game or their concert or whatever. We seem to be too busy to sit down and enjoy a meal together. And I think this has some impact on mental health. You can see pouring some wine here. I mentioned the red wine in moderation is beneficial, and it speaks toward a culture or a way of life. And finally, as I mentioned, physical activity is prominent in this part of the world where people daily are engaging in activity, maybe just walking, but it's a regular um, amount of physical activity. Focusing on a few of the things that are key that you get with a Mediterranean diet that you might not get with a Canadian diet. You've probably heard the term nutraceuticals. These are compounds largely found in fruits and vegetables. So those bright colors that I talked about that have a whole lot of health promoting benefits, both mental health and physical health wise. In terms of mental health, they actually modify your mood, minimize depression. Um, there are cognitive enhancing agents in these compounds. And incidentally, many of them, we're not even sure what they do. There's so many of these compounds, we're just discovering a lot of them. We know some of them are involved in central vascular function. So this involves increasing blood flow to the brain, which brings nutrients and removes metabolites, very beneficial. They're involved in reducing inflammation, which has a lot of negative aspects, increasing metabolism so that you're more energized, central activation of the nervous system, improved neural efficiency, and even angiogenesis, which is the formation of new blood vessels. So if you were starting to get some plaque development in blood vessels in the brain that were reducing blood flow and nutrients to the brain, that could be involved in dementia. You can actually generate new blood vessels and new routes to bring nutrients to those areas of the brain. This probably has a lot to do with decreasing dementia as we age. And of course, nobody wants to have that problem where you start forgetting everything, including people close to you. The other thing I want to talk a little bit about is the microorganisms that occupy our lower intestine and really function together to produce nutrients that we need. For instance, there are a lot of vitamins that these bacteria that live in our gut produce that we absorb into our bloodstream that make us more healthy. And there's a large number of these, and their makeup is different in different individuals and can change based on diet. You get these primarily from fermented foods that you consume. If you get ill and take an antibiotic, you can kill these and then you have to reestablish them. This is something that we're studying, trying to understand some of the details, but it's clear there's a huge effect on both mental and physical health. You may have heard the term prebiotics. These are fibrous plant foods that feed these good bacteria. So there are some bad bacteria, and if they take over, then your health starts to suffer and you may actually have full-blown disease. So if you consume fibrous plant foods, again, these are going to come primarily from fruits and vegetables, then the good bacteria in your gut will predominate and you'll be more healthy. A couple other things I wanted to bring up relative to nutrition and both physical and mental health is this whole idea of fasting and dieting and what's the best approach. Well, if you're interested in health and cognitive function and body composition, then intermittent fasting, which as the name implies means that you eat normally at some times and you fast at other times, is something to look into. The two most popular types involve what's been dubbed the 5 to 2 approach, which means you eat normally on 5 days of the week, and on 2 non-consecutive days in the week, you substantially reduce your food intake to about 25% of what you normally eat. So maybe Monday and Thursday, you eat 25% of what you normally eat. The other days you eat normally. So this would involve extended low-calorie intake periods. What is even more exciting, I think, is time-restricted eating, which, as the name would imply, has you eat all of your daily food intake within an 8-hour period in the day, and then the remaining 16 hours you fast completely, with the exception of water or non-caloric beverages, which is important because we don't want you to get dehydrated. So either over the course of a week or in the course of a day, you have periods of time when you're eating either very little or absolutely nothing. And I became familiar with this approach from a rodent study in 2012. And I want to show you just briefly the results of that study that's led to a lot of work by ourselves and others in humans using this same 16 and 8 approach. So what they did is they had 2 different diets and 2 types of eating. And this graph on the left is the amount of food that was eaten per mouse per day. And you can see that all 4 of the groups were the same. So keep that in mind, that even when you restricted the eating to 8 hours out of the 24, the animals that were restricted still ate the same amount of food. There were 2 different diets. The red bars correspond to a typical Canadian diet, high fat, high sugar, and the blue, more typical rodent diet, which is much more healthy. And the 2 styles of eating, the A here stands for ad libitum, meaning that the animals could eat whenever they wanted. Food tray was open 24 hours a day. And the T is time restricted. So the dark blue and the dark red are the 2 different diets with the time restricted eating pattern. And it's the pattern that's important, not what you're eating. As I mentioned, all 4 of the groups ate the same amount of food. The time restricted seem to be a little bit less, but not significantly less. But if you look at the rate of growth of the animals over 18 weeks, you can see that all of the animals were growing because these are adolescent mice. They haven't reached adult size, and mice continue to grow throughout their life. But if you look at the blue bar or the blue lines, you can see that the darker one, the time-restricted animals, are smaller across the board. Same is true of the unhealthy diet, where the time-restricted animals are much smaller. And it turns out the time-restricted animals are much less fat, even though they ate the same amount of food, which is kind of interesting, implies that they somehow handled the same amount of calories differently. And if you don't believe that this was a significant difference, take a look at these two animals. These animals started out at the same weight, the same age. This is the high-fat, high-sugar diet, the ad libitum animals that could eat 24 hours a day whenever they wanted, just like we do. We go to the fridge whenever we're hungry and we eat. These are the time-restricted animals. The body composition is very healthy here. These are very normal, healthy animals. These animals have developed diabetes. They have way more body fat. They don't walk around in their cage. They just lie in the cage. Their hair starts to fall out and they die younger than these animals. Most importantly, I guess, if you do this experiment and then you take these animals and you put them on a time-restricted eating pattern, the same diet, they revert back to this shape. So not only does eating regularly, like we do in Canada, produce obesity, you can get rid of it by changing the pattern of eating. And it works in humans as well. We can talk about that a little bit in the questions, but I want to cover a couple more things in the last couple of minutes here. You've probably heard of the ketogenic diet, and it has some health promoting benefits, both mental health and physical health, for probably similar reasons to the benefits of the intermittent fasting. First of all, let's just look at the diet. Here's a standard diet here. In Canada, we consume a little more than half of our calories per day from carbohydrate, which is this blue pie shape here, about 15% from protein, and about 30% from fat. That's typical. A ketogenic diet is about 70 to 85% fat. So big change in fat intake. Protein is about the same, and carbohydrate is reduced to very, very small amounts. Turns out that dietary carbohydrate has a lot to do with how fat you are. And if you reduce it down, even if you eat a lot of fat, not only do you not get fat, but you get leaner. If you are overweight, you will lose a lot of weight. Some of the things that happen is you upregulate your fat metabolism. So instead of using the energy and the carbohydrates that you eat, because you eat such a small amount, you start using the energy and the fats in your body. And so you lose a lot of body weight. I'll show you some data in a minute. But interestingly enough, your cognition actually goes up. If you measure performance in school or IQ tests or just basic cognitive function tests, after a few days on this diet, your cognition actually goes up. As I mentioned, you lose body fat. Let's take a look at this graph here. This is loss of body weight on the y-axis versus months of intervention here for up to 2 years. And there were 3 types of diet here. The red data is a classic low-fat diet, which is what everybody has tried and doesn't work very well. What you see with that is there's a rapid decrease because you're restricting calories. The values level off, and then there's a small regain over time. So you end up with maybe 3 kilos loss of body weight over a couple of years. The yellow line is the Mediterranean style diet that I talked about earlier, and the blue line is a high fat diet, identified here as low carbohydrate. but that means it's very high fat. And so this ketogenic diet promotes a greater fat loss and a better retention of that fat loss over time. So if you get out here to 2 years, we're talking about 5 kilos versus about 3 on the low calorie diet. Notice the Mediterranean diet you don't lose as much weight initially, but over 2 years, it's about the same. So again, this Mediterranean diet seems to be very health promoting, not only from a mental health standpoint, but from a body fat content. One of the problems with this diet, though, is it's really hard to adhere to. If you try and eat 80% fat, almost everything you're eating is fat, and that's very difficult. Most people can't stick to this for very long. And when they start reverting back to eating more carbohydrate, they gain the weight back. The other thing is that there's a lot of micronutrients and phytochemicals in fruits and vegetables, which have to be largely eliminated from a diet that you're consuming all fat. So it's easy to become deficient in some micronutrients. So this is going to require supplementation to prevent that. And I'll just finish before I open it up for questions. I'm very excited about the health benefits of physical activity and want everyone to appreciate that any exercise is better than nothing. So walking to the end of your driveway and back, if you're not doing that now, is something that you should start doing. And what you'll find is as you become more active, it's easier to be active. You feel better, you can walk faster, you get more benefits. The key is to remember to start at a moderate or even a slow pace. You don't want to overdo it. If you haven't exercised significantly in 10 or 20 years, don't go out and start sprinting around the neighborhood. That's likely going to cause problems. The other thing to keep in mind, as I mentioned initially, intensity is way more important than duration. And it's amazing how brief an exercise bout can be and can be really health promoting, both mentally and physically. For example, if you do a series of 3 to 5 bouts of exercise that are as short as 10 to 20 second efforts. So say I go and exercise for 10 seconds and then I exercise slowly or just recover for 2 minutes. And I repeat that 3 to 5 times. So my entire exercise bout, if it was 3 bouts of 10 seconds, that would be 30 seconds of activity interspersed with 2 minutes of recovery. So it would take me about 7 or 8 minutes to do that. And if you do that 2 or 3 times a week, there are huge health benefits. So what I do now 3 times a week is I do 12 minutes of exercise, and I'm getting more or similar benefits to what I used to get with an hour of jogging exercise. So first of all, it takes me 12 minutes, not an hour, and it actually promotes a lot of health benefits that you don't get with regular, more prolonged exercise. So very little exercise is hugely beneficial. What does it do? Well, the main thing it does is increase your fitness, which we measure as your ability to consume oxygen. And that goes down as you get older. If you become active, it goes up. And if you can maintain your ability to consume oxygen, that's inversely correlated with all-cause mortality. So the higher your oxygen consumption, the lower your death rate from all causes. So that's really, really significant. Other things that happen is you lose body fat, you improve your blood fat metabolism, which is closely associated with heart disease. And really important that people don't appreciate, your cognition goes up, just like when you have a high fat diet or you're intermittently fast, cognitive function goes up. And maybe the most important factor is near perfect adherence to this type of exercise. In other words, when we show people how to do this and they start doing it, they continue to do it at virtually 100%. Very few people will stop doing this. It's not only because it's brief and doesn't take much time, but I think it's because it positively stimulates your brain. You feel good when you do it. So the other type of exercise, the jogging type of exercise, moderate intensity prolonged, it's health promoting. But remember, as I said at the beginning, very few people will do it on a regular basis. So as far as I'm concerned, if it does something but no one will do it, it's worthless. We have to find something that works and people will do. This type of exercise is health promoting and people will do it at a much higher rate. So if we want to get all Canadians to exercise, this is how we're going to get them to exercise. It's not going to be going out for 45 minutes and walking or jogging. It's going to be doing a little more intense but very brief exercise. And again, want to really emphasize you need to work up to this. We use an 8 on a 10-point scale of difficulty. So if 10 is very difficult, we want you to be exercising eventually at about 8 on a 10-point scale. And so it doesn't have to be as hard as you can go. It just has to be more intense than a walk or a jog if you're really fit. But a walk can be plenty sufficient initially. So start easy, and as you start to feel better, build up to it. And in conclusion, what I've got here is a bunch of different dietary approaches. Here's the Mediterranean diet down here, very different from the Canadian diet. Here's the ketogenic diet. Here's the paleo diet or carnivorous diet that we didn't really talk about. Here's a plant-based diet. Here's a low-fat, low-calorie diet. And these ones, I think, are more on the periphery. What I want to focus on here is the fundamentals that overlap in all of them. So the good parts of all of these diets. We need to emphasize whole foods. So get away from packages. If you got to open a package, don't eat it. Make sure you get enough high-quality protein. That doesn't have to be from meat. It can come from beans and legumes and vegetables. Incorporate lots of vegetables. Try and have 2/3 of your plate be vegetables. Prioritize high nutrient density foods, and that means fruits and vegetables, colorful foods. Eat slowly. And I think that's really important. We need to eat until we're no longer hungry, not until we're stuffed. Most of us overeat. Just eat smaller portions until you're not hungry anymore, and you'll end up eating less and have a more optimal body composition. And minimize processed foods. Again, those are the ones that come in packages. Let me stop there. I think I've got about 10 minutes left for questions. If people have to leave, I understand. But feel free to put questions in the chat. Adam's going to follow him for me, or maybe he'll unmute you and you can ask away, whatever is most convenient.
Thanks, Peter. The first question coming in here says that in a number of studies, it indicates that fasting works better for human males than females. Was this found in the animal studies?
Sadly, from a female perspective, yes. It does seem to work a little better in men than women, more consistently in men than women. However, most women we've studied, it does work, and that applies both to rodents and to humans. I think the main difference is that women are better at defending their body mass, whether it is normal or abnormal, than men are. And we have some data way back from World War II in the prison camps in Germany, where the prisoners were underfed and women survived to a much greater extent than the men did. And the reason women survived greater is that women have the ability to slow down their metabolism to preserve their essential organs so that they can survive a starvation situation better than men. And I think what happens with any kind of dietary approach is some women go into starvation mode and they start slowing their metabolism in order to preserve what they have, even if it's abnormally high. But in our hands, I don't want to be too discouraging. It does seem to work in a lot of women, but it's highly individual. It may take 2 weeks to start working in one individual. It may take 2 months in another. So my advice would be to stick with it. Don't give up early. You may be just a slower responder, and you may kick in if you stick with it.
I've got a number of questions asking for examples of what exercises to do in those short, intense periods. So could you suggest some examples or point people in the direction of resources?
Absolutely. Remember when I said that any exercise is good. So it can be walking, it can be biking, it can be swimming, it can be rowing. Any mode of exercise will work. The key is it's got to be a little more intense than probably what you're used to. But you start out with very modest intensity. So if you haven't been exercising, literally walk to the end of your driveway and back. That's an overload initially. Then walk to the corner. Maybe walk to the store to do your grocery shopping instead of driving in the car. You can impose an overload by extending the duration or the intensity. Initially, you have to do a little bit of duration so you get used to it. And then you want to start picking up the pace, going toward an 8 out of a 10-point scale. So not as hard as you can go, but hard enough that it's a little bit challenging. But again, we want to do that after you've been exercising for a few weeks to work up to it. Otherwise, you'll pull muscles, you'll hurt yourself. If you're a little bit older, we tend to lose our balance more easily. We don't want you falling down. One of the things that happens when you become more active is you improve your balance. People who exercise regularly don't fall like people who don't. And that's a huge benefit because often when you fall, you hurt yourself. You may break a bone in falling. So any type of exercise, moderate intensity initially until you get used to it and then pick up the pace, trying to get for an 8 on a 10-point scale.
We've got a couple questions related to fat content, specifically looking at dairy. So is it better to choose like higher fat percentages of things like cottage cheese versus low fat?
The low-fat dietary approach doesn't work. It's a fallacy. It was promoted starting in the 1960s up to the present day. It really doesn't work. The significant factor is how many calories you consume. If you eat high caloric dense foods, but you eat less of them, that can be beneficial. That's why the ketogenic diet works. Fat has more than twice the calories of carbohydrate or protein, but when you eat 80% fat, you end up eating less calories because the diet is very satiating. You feel full when you've eaten less. And it really comes down to how many calories you've eaten. If you eat less, then you're expending more than you're consuming, and you're going to lose body weight, and it's going to come from the fat component. So don't be so concerned about eating fat. Eating fat doesn't make you fat. Eating more calories makes you fat. A high carbohydrate diet will make you fat. That's the main reason why Canadians are fat. We eat way too much carbohydrate for our activity levels. We sit around on the couch watching TV and eating carbohydrate. That's what we need to stop doing.
So another question here, now switching over to a different macronutrient, looking at carbohydrates and sugars. So we know to avoid processed sugars, but what about sugars from fruit? And should we be avoiding things like fruit juices and fruit smoothies?
The sugars in fruits are better than processed sugars, but they're still sugars. So vegetables are better than fruits in terms of that category of eating. But fruits in moderation are fine. The vegetables should be a major component of your diet for sure. The other part of this is that if you're regularly physically active, sugars are a primary fuel for exercise. So if you're active, you won't be retaining the sugars in your body. You'll be oxidizing them for exercise energy. Another huge benefit of exercise, you'll be lean because you're using the carbohydrates that you're eating for energy. So a physically active person can get by with more sugars than a non-active person. So if we get everyone active, that's going to help a great deal, even if you are eating some sugars.
So this question, I'm just going to interpret this in one of two ways here. Either taking a look at efficacy or even safety. So is it okay to do high intensity during the fasting period?
It's something that we're looking at right now. Personally, that's what I do myself. I do the high intensity exercise toward the end of the fast. I've been doing a 16 and 8 approach for over 5 years. And it's very easy to do. It's not like any other diet you've been on. You rapidly adapt to it over the first week or so. And one theory is that if you exercise toward the end of the fast, when fat metabolism is maximized, you're going to get most of your energy from fat. We're studying that now. We don't have enough data to conclude that, but that's the theory. You're certainly expending the energy. Whether you're getting more of it from fat, I'm not sure at this point, but theoretically, you may be partitioning the energy primarily from fat, which would be advantageous, assuming you're a little bit over fat to begin with.
I got one more question. Fish oil supplementation. So from a brain functioning and mental health standpoint, is it something that we should be taking?
Yeah, I would recommend it unless you are, a couple of times a week deep ocean fish eater. I consume fish several times a week, and I take a daily fish oil supplement. The omega-3 content of the fish is very health promoting from a cognitive dementia brain health point of view. And so I think that would be a wise choice. And it's filtered to remove any contaminants. So if you're worrying about heavy metals that sometimes accumulate in fish, that's removed. So it's much safer than eating contaminated fish.
I don't see any more questions coming through here. So I just want to thank you, Dr. Lemon, for taking time out of your busy schedule to join us today. As many of you guys know, the nutrition and fitness world can be very difficult to navigate because often it's the media that misinterprets or purposely skews the research. So it's wonderful to have such a credible source deliver this session for us.
Well, thanks a lot, Adam. I really appreciate the opportunity. It's always fun to come and talk about your passion, and softball and nutrition are my passions. So it's great to get a chance to share some of the information.